Hello everybody. Welcome to a discussion of my book, Chapter 3, How to Measure a New Employee's Performance. My name is Jeff Stinson. I'm with Global Human Resources Outsourcing, and the book is A Practical Guide to Human Resources Management. So how to measure an employee's performance? Well, first of all, let's admit that performance management is more than just filling out a performance review form. And I think that's really, really important. You need to design goals that tie into the organization's goals. So every employee has a set of goals which ties into the organization's goals. We call these goals SMART goals, or S-M-A-R-T, which stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, with a time frame. So let's talk about these individually. Let's start with specific. What is a specific goal? It's a definition of the outcome that you're looking for. So for example, if you said something like, you need to improve quality. Is that specific? I don't think so. If you changed it to say you need to improve quality of your reports by 95%, that would be far more specific, and the employee would then understand what it is they need to do. So a goal should be something that brings improvement to the department and thus to the overall organization. Let's talk about measurable. Measurable is how will you know when your employee has met the goal that you've set for them. You should use numbers, percentages, completion times, dates, etc., and that will help you define that. So what would a good goal sound like? Distribute the monthly financial report by the 5th day of the month 100% of the time. That's very measurable. Action-oriented. It should state a goal using an action verb such as improve, reduce, start, and complete. So for example, you would say things like improve quality, reduce inventory, complete the project by January 1. Realistic. This is always the most difficult one, I think. Is the goal that you're setting realistic? And one way to look at that would be to ask yourself, is that something you could achieve? Are you asking more of your employee than you're asking of yourself? I think that 3 to 6 significant goals over any 12-month period is enough. Any more might seem overwhelming. And make sure that you ask your employee if they feel that these are realistic, because if they don't, what happens is they often just give up and don't even try. And lastly is the time frame, setting a deadline for meeting the goal. And for example, if the project is very complex, you might want to set miniature goals along the way instead of having one massive goal. And the goal needs to be clearly worded using a formula. And the formula starts with to, followed by an action verb, plus some result by a certain date, and plus a performance standard which we would set, or a cost or quantifier. So for example, to increase sales in the department by 30% by December 15th with an increase of overhead of less than $5,000. That would meet all of those criteria. Now let's talk about effective written feedback, because at some point in time you do need to fill out that form and you do need to give the employee their review. And while it's not the only piece of the performance management system, it is an important one. So the form should include things like the employee's name, their title, the department they're in, the date of the hire, review period, etc. It should have a section called position outcomes. Position outcome is really a 2 to 3 sentence description of the outcome of the position. Another way to look at that is, why does the position exist at all? You should have a section on accomplishments. Again, this would be 3 to 4 things the employees accomplished during the year and should relate back to those goals that we discussed earlier. These are not the day-to-day things an employee always does, but these are things that have an impact on the department and therefore have an impact on the company. There should be a section on strengths. Strengths should be 3 or 4 things the employee does really, really well. Be sure to include specific examples, because oftentimes when you say an employee does something well, they're not quite sure what you mean. So if you give them an example, then it makes more sense. There should also be areas for improvement. Everybody has things they can improve on. And I would suggest, again, 2 or 3 things the employee should improve on. But I would also, in this case, be more specific of how important that improvement needs to be. So for example, it could be something that has low importance. In other words, if they improve that particular area of improvement, they might get a better review next time. But it's not a showstopper, if you will. It could be moderately important. In that case, this could be something that could cause their performance to get worse over time if they didn't improve it, and they should consider that. And then, of course, the last one would be critical, and that's an area of improvement that if it's not fixed by the next review period, could lead to their termination. There should be a section on employee professional growth. Here's where you would set up a plan to help them achieve their professional goals over the course of the next year. And lastly, of course, an overall performance rating. There's no magic to this. You have to pick categories that the organization can accept. Some people like to use satisfactory, good, average, whatever the case may be. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure that it makes sense to the organization. So, lastly, we have to talk about the performance conversation, and that may be the hardest part. It's one thing to set goals. It's another thing to write these things down, but eventually you need to sit in front of the employee and have this conversation. So the things I'd like to talk about are things like behavior versus trait-based. In other words, are you discussing the employee's behavior, or are you talking about their traits? We should talk about specific versus general. Always be specific. Employees don't know what you're talking about unless you give them specific examples. Generalities don't help you change performance. There's the consideration of objective versus subjective issues. The more objective, the better. If you can talk about numbers and dates and times and things like that, much more effective in changing performance than talking about subjective things. Fact-based observations versus emotionally charged. Sometimes, particularly with difficult employees, we go into the review a little angry, a little upset, and we become emotionally charged as opposed to sticking to the facts. Constructive versus accusatory. Constructive is always more valuable than accusing the employee. And then lastly, clear versus vague. The more clear you are, the more likely you are to have a good conversation with the employee versus vague. Now, I have examples in my book that you're welcome to take a look at, which gives you actual sentences and examples of each of those that I've just discussed. So some final thoughts. First of all, schedule and keep the appointment to give the review. This is an important thing to the employee. It should be scheduled in advance. You should be respectful of that and keep the appointment. Nothing sends a worse signal to an employee than constantly changing the date and the time. Secondly, make sure everybody's prepared. That means you need to be prepared with all of your fact-based information. The employee should also be prepared. I would recommend that you give them a copy of the review ahead of time and give them a couple, 3 days to take a look at it and decide if they have any concerns. They'll come better prepared to the meeting. Allow sufficient time. I would leave an hour. It might not take that long, but it could take a little bit longer, so leave it an uninterrupted period of time. And lastly, create a positive, non-threatening atmosphere. This is a conversation. This is a discussion of your employee's performance, and you should take advantage of that to help them grow. Thank you very much. My book is available on Amazon. Again, the title is A Practical Guide to Human Resources Management, and I appreciate your time.